Firstly, just to welcome you all, say I wish I was actually seeing you all in person, but still, this is a great deal better than nothing. To say that I'm actually just giving 3 lectures this year, 2 general and comparative, one on imperial monarchy in Russia, but that I'm also giving 3 seminars, and you should treat those seminars as your forum for discussion. You don't need to confine yourself to the topics of these 3 lectures. You can cover anything I've written in the book or elsewhere, or any ideas you yourself want to bring to the discussion. So that is a brief opening statement, but what I'm going to talk about today is essentially the emperor in world history. What I will do in my second lecture is talk specifically about what it meant to rule an empire as distinct from other sorts of polity. And what I will do in my third lecture is to talk about the Russian hereditary imperial monarchy and monarchs, of course. All right, so just a little introduction. I mean, the book is about a job, and even more, it is about the people who filled that job. The job was ruling an empire, and so my heroes are emperors. Now, just a word of warning. You may think you know exactly what an emperor is, and that is a dangerous illusion. Emperors come in many shapes and sizes. Apart from anything else, emperors fulfilled many different duties. They were, to some extent, the supreme source of legitimate authority. They were, in a sense, priest monarchs, sacred. They were chief political officers, heads of state and government. They were often warrior kings. They might well be the head of the propaganda outfit, the soft power of their regime. They might be the impresario of their court. They're, in other words, and they were always dynasts, in other words, heads of families. So there are many different roles, and to some extent, depending on individuals, to some extent, depending on dynastic traditions, to some extent, depending on broader, cultural traditions, you will get emperors emphasizing certain aspects of these many roles rather than others. Obvious example, the name for emperor comes from the Roman imperator, which in Republican days meant a successful general. And in a sense, that tells you about much of the essence or the most important element of the job of a Roman emperor, which was to be a military leader. And to some extent, that tradition comes down in the European tradition of monarchy. And it certainly also comes down in the tradition of monarchy inherited from the warrior leaders of the steppe. The name given to the first Chinese emperor, Huang Di, has nothing whatsoever to do with military power or indeed really political authority. It is a word with all sorts of sacred and cosmological implications and symbols. And that does tell you something fundamental about differences between what one might describe as a Confucian or Confucian Buddhist tradition of monarchy and a Roman or steppe martial tradition of monarchy. And yet, the distinction is anything but clear-cut. Chinese emperors were chief ritualists, but they were also, at least in principle, always chief political officers of their empire. And some of them did lead their armies in battle, or at least exercised supreme military authority, in just the same way that the Roman emperor, and indeed the various European dynastic monarchs, who to some extent followed the Roman tradition, were not just military and political leaders, they were also semi-sacred. So there is a blurring. So, what I'm introducing to you is a basic 65% truth with 35% nuance. What I'm talking about are the rulers of some of the most, or indeed many of the most important polities in history. And in many cases also, some of the most important and remarkable rulers of these polities. Empires mattered, emperors mattered. That's why I spent 6 years writing this book. So, I mean, of course I'm going to say that. What I am covering is 5 millennia of history and most of the globe. So this is a book on a sort of spectacular scale. Now, to make any sense of a book on that kind of scale, you need concepts, you need comparisons, you need generalizations. Otherwise, it's just a complete, unorganized collection of tales about individuals. But nevertheless, this book is about individual human beings. It's to a significant degree about biography. And there, inevitably, there is a tension at the heart of the book, deliberate, between, on the one hand, the absolute need for structure, and on the other hand, the fact that individuals and biography always defies structure. So, there is the tension. It is deliberate. I think really the book is 3 things simultaneously. It is a biography, perhaps a collective biography, to some extent a collection of biographies. It is also a study in leadership. And it is also what you might describe as an anatomy of a specific type of political system, hereditary imperial monarchy. Now, those 3 words are about the most politically incorrect words in contemporary English you could imagine. Hereditary imperial monarchy. But before, you begin getting excited and indignant, you do have to remember that hereditary monarchy, and to some extent hereditary imperial monarchy, was the most prevalent form of political system for most of human history. So it is worth studying. Because the past did not make this type of political system the predominant one for no reason. All right, that's just my introduction. I think, or at least when I was thinking about emperors, the heroes, if you like, of this book, I thought of them really in 5 ways. They were individuals. You cannot escape from biography. They were human beings. They were leaders, they were hereditary monarchs, and they were the rulers of empire. Now, I can't talk about biography. I could give a 1-hour lecture on some individual emperors. Obviously, in the course of this lecture, I can't go into that kind of detail. On the other hand, I'm going to wait until tomorrow to talk about what it meant to rule an empire, what empires were, what ruling them entailed. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the 3 other categories. The emperor as a human being, the emperor as a leader, and the emperor as a hereditary monarch. And inevitably, I will have to be brief, sketch over these, these crucial elements in the story. Okay, of course, it's completely banal to say that emperors were human beings. What else did you think? I thought they were frogs or rhinos or something. Nevertheless, it's good to start with basics. If you're a human being, you don't live long. You wonder where you came from and where you will go after death. You look at the sky and the stars and seek meaning. You wonder whether there is some message in the stars. Every human society has done that. Humans are basically social animals. We need company. We need usually some version of friendship. We certainly need sex, and we are usually capable of love. We need rest, etc., etc. All very obvious, facts in the existence of all human beings, or virtually all human beings. The basic point is that very ordinary human elements, needs, can take on dramatic implications when they are the needs or the drives of a human being who rules over a vast empire. Let's start with friendship. There is a problem here because loneliness is the lot of political leaders. And loneliness is probably even more so the lot of hereditary, and even more than that, hereditary imperial monarchs. You're raised so far above the rest of the human race that in many ways it is difficult to establish what we would think of as an authentic human contact. Friendship, for instance. What does friendship mean? Well, I think probably most of us would think that friendship entails a degree of equality. You know, repartee, jokes, irreverence, even just the simple fact of touching someone you're talking to, well, you very often happen to be rather careful about touching an emperor. It might be seen as lèse-majesté. It's interesting that the Romans, or Roman literature and Roman letters, praise some of the greatest Roman emperors because they were capable of friendship. That was very much part of the Roman aristocratic tradition of seeing the emperor as one of us, a great aristocrat among other aristocrats. Marcus Aurelius taught this, so did Antoninus Pius, the lot of them. On the other hand, time and time again, when one is looking at other imperial monarchies and dynasties, you will hear repeated the comment by tutors, for instance, of heirs to the throne, that you must never expect to have real friends because it is inherent in your role that you have to be a man apart. You must never open yourself up to anyone completely, and least of all to anyone who is in the political world and is in principle your lieutenant. Very interesting nuances there. And because the people I'm studying were human beings, you sometimes see the tremendous conflict between their desire for friendship, their desire to have real companions, and on the other hand, sometimes with the more insecure of them, but in particular insecure monarchs, a deep fear that they would be caught, captured, anxiety for friendship, and at the same time rebuffing anyone who was too familiar, too close, etc., etc., etc. And this often ends up in tragedy. Harun al-Rashid has killed his great childhood friend. So does Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman emperor, etc., etc., etc. So there are problems. There are problems. Remember the comment of Louis XIV to his heir that absolutely under no circumstances should the monarch ever allow any friend to monopolize the channels of patronage and information on which the ruler's power and effectiveness in the end depended. And Louis said that was even more true in terms of not letting a beloved mistress do that, because, as he put it, of the natural charms and craftiness of women, and of course the extra hold that sex gave them over the supreme power holder. All right. Another element of being human, looking at the stars and seeking meaning. Religion, in other words. Where do I come from? Where will I go? Where have my ancestors gone? What is the link between the heavens and me? All these kind of things. And of course, this becomes regularized and systemized in the great universal religions. And one of the things I do in this book is compare a monarchy in the great salvation religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc., etc. A monarch's search for meaning could have dramatic implications. Now, when monarchs converted to a religion, a salvation religion, and usually insisted that their subjects follow them, of course, they were not making those decisions in most cases simply because of a personal quest for meaning. There were always political calculations involved. And yet, on the other hand, it is too cynical, too crude, and simply wrong to imagine that their own personal search for meaning and their own personal understanding of what religion offered the most plausible meaning, the richest meaning to life, did matter a very great deal. I could give you lots of examples of this, but there is a whole chapter in the book dedicated to Emperor Ashoka, back in the 3rd century BCE in India, in the Mauryan dynasty. And I think it is fair to say, firstly, that there was nothing at all inevitable about Ashoka choosing Buddhism as his religion. It was a relatively small sect in India. I think it is also fair to say that if he had not chosen Buddhism, the religion would have in time died out or remained a very small sect. Instead of which, of course, it now dominates much of Asia, had big influence elsewhere in the world, and is of enormous historical and cultural significance. So there you have a decision made by an emperor more than 2,000 years ago, which still has dramatic implications for today's world. The fact, for example, that unlike his grandfather, who also became a religious ascetic, if you like, Ashoka did not abdicate and withdraw from the world. The fact also that Ashoka was a missionary. He believed that it was his duty to spread Buddhism not just across his own kingdom or empire, but much more broadly. All of this is of crucial importance for the later development and survival of Buddhism. And then, of course, another even more obvious commonality, if you're talking about human beings, is the life cycle. You know, where infants, where children, etc., etc. They were seen, you were old, we die. And this is just completely banal. It's a fundamental fact of human nature, but it is an extremely important fact when you are looking at hereditary monarchy. You know, if the monarch is a child, then the dynasty is vulnerable. Even if you're talking about an old and deeply legitimate dynasty, though the child is probably unlikely to be overthrown, a regency is always a time of uncertainty and weakness. With new dynasties, it may be fatal. There are countless examples of new dynasties which don't survive, simply because there's a child on the throne and he's pushed aside by some general, some this, some that. And then right at the other end, and even more central to my book, are the problems of growing old. You know, by the time an emperor grows old, he may have been on the throne for 20, 25 years. You know, we talk about megalomania taking over modern CEOs if they've been in office for 10 years. What about an emperor who hasn't opened a door for himself in 25 years? By that time, all the people to whom he might privately have to some extent deferred, a mother, a former tutor, an experienced minister he inherited from his father, they're all long since dead. So are his uncles, you know. He's older than his ministers, he's more experienced, he's also tired, he may be stubborn, all the things we associate with old age. And a remarkable number of the dynasties I study faced disaster precisely because rulers simply hung on in office too long. Disaster might only be temporary, or in some cases it might be terminal. I'll give you just one little example. I could give you others. I mean, actually not so little. This is Emperor Tang Xuanzong, and he reigned from 711 to 756 CE. And he was, you know, a monarch of China's probably greatest dynasty at the time. And he was actually an exceptionally competent and effective monarch for most of his reign. He chose good lieutenants, he managed them, he patted them on the head, he got them to work together. He also, in the last instance, made the key decisions. He adjudicated, he even to some extent set the overall direction of politics, etc., 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 all the things that you associate with a good monarch. He was also actually an exceptionally interesting and cultured and aesthetically sensitive individual, and his court was as much a model for East Asia as Louis XIV's Versailles was for Europe. But after 30 years on the throne, Xuanzong was just very tired. You know, politics is a grueling business. Managing the ambitious, competitive, tough types who get to the top of the political system is never easy. Getting them to work together is not easy. Managing very difficult problems, such as, for instance, how to feed a capital city of 1 million people, in what was becoming, for all sorts of reasons, an increasingly barren region. Very, very difficult problems. And he was exhausted and he was bored. And after about 35 years on the throne, he basically began thinking of his soul and the afterlife and this and that. And he essentially devolved power to his prime minister, who was a distant cousin. And then, in the way, unfortunately, typical of aging men, he also sought the elixir of eternal youth in the arms of a beautiful young woman, his concubine, who was called Yang Yuhuan. Well, that's all right. I mean, he had fresh lychees delivered to her, every day by special, express delivery from 1,500 miles away. Well, extravagant, but fine. The problem was, though, that she increasingly began to play a political role. And when his cousin, the prime minister, died, she persuaded him to put in as prime minister her own relative. And it is in the nature of politics in general, but even more in the nature specifically of Tang-era politics, but also of court politics in general, that politics often comes down to aristocratic lineage, patronage, clientelist networks. So the new prime minister begins clearing out all the clients of the old prime minister. Unfortunately, among the clients of the old prime minister is the most powerful general in the army, An Lushan. Seeing that the aging emperor was not going to protect him and realizing that if he didn't strike now, his power would disappear and would probably end up in him being executed as well, An Lushan strikes, and the rebellion comes very close to destroying the Tang dynasty and does cripple it. The Tang dynasty never recovers from the rebellion. And you might say, well, all right, that's all very splendid and, great, wonderful sort of detective story or historical romance. But this was, after all, in the 750s, and that is a long time ago. But again, you have to remember that the An Lushan rebellion is the reason why China definitively withdraws from Central Asia. Before the An Lushan rebellion, Tang dynasty China was in competition with Islam, the Caliphate, for areas in for Central Asia, essentially, Samarkand, Bukhara, Uzbekistan, all these places we talk about now, which are now solidly Muslim. So, the fact that a vast region of the world ends up securely in the Muslim camp rather than in the camp of East Asian Confucian civilization has something to do with an aging emperor falling for a beautiful concubine. It's not, of course, the total explanation. Things might easily have gone that way anyway, but it does bring home the idea that what seem like deeply trivial and personal issues can have enormous political implications. So does that mean that I am arguing for some kind of unchanging human personality? And the answer, of course, is no. Humanity has changed, and certainly human mentalities have changed enormously over the course of whatever it is, 5 millennia. As an example, it seems to me, of how one can and cannot make comparisons, I like the comparison between the Roman Emperor Julian, we're talking about the 4th century CE, and the Holy Roman Emperor, in other words, Habsburg Emperor Joseph II, at the end of the 18th century CE. Now, in some ways, you can see similar personality traits. These were both intelligent men. They were, especially Julian, sort of intellectuals of a sort. They were also impatient and could veer towards hysteria under pressure and at times of crisis. You can see other sort of structural comparisons as well. Rarely, not uniquely, but rarely for hereditary emperors, both Julian and Joseph came to the throne with radical reform programs. In Julian's case, to restore the pagan gods, roll back the policy of Christianization introduced by his uncle Constantine. In Joseph II's case, to push forward the radical Enlightenment, to take it in a more radical direction than it had taken under his mother, Maria Theresa. And you can also make a structural comparison in that both men's radical programs of domestic reform were, to a very significant extent, defeated and undermined because they simultaneously went in for adventurous, ambitious foreign policies, which ended in disaster. So there are, interesting similarities and comparisons to be made. And yet, of course, if one's talking about the mentality of these two men, their ideas, there's a complete chasm between Julian's world of Greek pagan mythology and gods, Neoplatonic metaphysics, you name it, and Joseph II, who is a child of the rational, utilitarian, scientific Enlightenment. Joseph used to let out enormous snorts whenever he came across what he thought of as superstition and sort of, metaphysical sort of, phraseology. Well, of course, he would have let out a simply vast snort if he'd ever come across Julian. So that's all I will say about, emperors as human beings. Obviously, I could say more. Go on to my next section, which is emperors as leaders. Now, there is a vast literature from the business schools about leadership. Interestingly, although there are many biographies of leaders, actually professional academic history doesn't spend much time at the moment thinking conceptually or comparatively about leadership. Most of the literature from the business school world was not much use to me. Some of it was. It is obvious common sense to say that a hereditary emperor is not a normal leader. For a start, he is almost always both sovereign and sacred. He is not chosen by nor responsible to an electorate or to a cabinet of ministers or to a board of directors. He's in a different position in that sense. And if you're talking, as in most cases I am, about the hereditary rulers of dynasties which have been in power for centuries, that adds to the sense of entitlement, the aura, the authority of the people I'm studying. No contemporary ruler can match that. Machiavelli, although he wrote the most famous book about royal leadership, The Prince, actually isn't really talking about most of the people I study. The men who established dynasties were, to some extent, Machiavelli types. They were also, in many cases, rather similar to modern strongmen, Vladimir Putin, or whatever you want to call it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a real distinction, as Machiavelli himself recognized, between those leaders and men who belong to long-established dynasties and are regarded almost universally as legitimate hereditary monarchs. It's not black and white. A legitimate hereditary monarch needs many of the skills that Machiavelli outlines, but he doesn't need them to quite the same degree or in quite the same way. Just to give you a tiny example, Machiavelli, for instance, said that no prince should allow someone else to command his armies. Well, that is by definition an impossible ask for any emperor. It was, after all, precisely because a Roman emperor could actually not trust other men to command his armies that the Roman Empire was so vulnerable to succession crises, civil wars, etc., etc. So, on the other hand, if you are a leader and you are attempting to lead human beings in order to achieve certain goals, if to do that, as is almost always the case, you have to create a team of ministers, you have to get them to work together, except at cross purposes, you have to steer them in a common direction, you have to manage their arguments, you have to work out whose advice you can trust and whose you can't. There are certain common traits. I mean, at its most basic, as we saw with poor Kang Xuanzong, I mean, politics is a grueling business. If you're going to be a supreme leader for decades, you're going to have to be physically and emotionally tough and thick-skinned. I mean, read Marcus Aurelius's, Meditations. He was more sensitive probably than most emperors, but his sense that you were always out there, you were always criticized, people pretended to sympathize with you, but actually envied, etc., etc. So you get the same in Tang Taizong's instructions to his son as well. So there are certain characteristics there. And that, I think, means that some of the business school literature is useful. Some of the biographies and autobiographies of contemporary political leaders do ring a bell for me. And in just the same way, the memoirs of a Louis XIV is advice to his son, or Tang Taizong's, or Charles V to his son, they resonate. It still makes sense. The loneliness of power is one theme which comes through always, etc. And then, just as a little subset of that, I mean, there's quite a significant literature in the business school world about crisis management. Well, again, that resonates. You have to make decisions quickly on the basis of inadequate evidence, under great pressure, sometimes at actual risk to yourself. It's not altogether surprising that it is very often emperors who have a military background who are best at that. It is inherent in generalship that you're having to make decisions quickly, bravely, resolutely, under enormous threat, danger, pressure, you name it. And in a sense, threat of revolution, coup d'etat, crisis, that is in the same generic basket. Rather interesting that Yuri Pines, who I think is one of the most fascinating professors of Chinese imperial history, he wrote in one of his books about Chinese dynastic leadership, the rise and fall of Chinese empires and dynasties. At times of crisis, when swift and resolute decision-making was required, many emperors proved completely inadequate, fluctuating between competing court factions, acting erratically and hastening their dynasty's demise. Well, that, to my mind, is an excellent description of Louis XVI's behavior in 1789. Personally, I tend to think that if the French throne had been inherited in 1774 by a man similar in ability and commitments and values and beliefs to Louis's brother-in-law, Leopold II, the later Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, poor Marie Antoinette's brother, I think there probably would not have been a French Revolution. Just a hunch. It's just a hunch. Finally, in this section on leadership, is the emperor what we call a CEO, a chief executive officer? Can he, in any useful sense, be described that way or compared to contemporary CEOs? And if you read your Financial Times 4 days a week, they'll have a discussion about what it means to be a CEO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I take being a CEO to mean managing a complex bureaucratic organization. And the interesting answer there is that no European monarch was really a CEO in that sense until the 18th century, just possibly Philip II. But the Spanish setup is rather different in the 16th century. It's not really until the later 18th century, I think, that you can talk of a European monarch, certainly of an emperor, as being, a true CEO. But if you look at 12th century China, you could argue that the Sung emperor already is a sort of CEO. And some of the challenges he faces and some of the responses of Sung emperors to those challenges, managing complex bureaucratic organizations, are a forewarning of how other emperors, European emperors, will respond to similar challenges in the 19th century. You have to remember that the Sung economy, and in many ways Sung society, had reached a level which was not equaled anywhere else on earth until late 18th century England, really, in terms of certainly economic development. And among the things that the Sung dynasty does, or the Sung government does, is to create a formidable fiscal system which is capable of tapping that non-agrarian economy. Then you have to remember that, the Sung army is a professional army of 1 million men, an army which needs to be paid, fed, trained, equipped, moved, etc. That is a formidable undertaking. For any state, no European state faces anything like that until way into the 19th century. And then you also have to remember, the extraordinary engineering and hydraulic feats of Sung dynasty China, as it tries, not by any means always successfully, for instance, to manage the Yellow River with its dikes and its hydraulic works and God only knows what. So perhaps it's not surprising that one is already seeing in the history and the stories of 12th century Sung emperors a foretaste of what one will later see in European monarch stories 700 years later, European emperor stories. All right, that is all I will say about leadership, and I will spend the rest of the lecture talking about hereditary monarchy, and I think that's about another 15 minutes. Is it 15, 20, something? Yeah. I suppose one needs to start, if you're talking about hereditary monarchy, by asking a sort of naive but very important question. Look, it is self-evident that if you were trying to choose the most competent people to be political leaders, it is self-evident that the best way to do that is not through biological chance. We are aware of that. Of course, the ancient Greeks were aware of it, but so were the ancient Chinese and the ancient Indian political thinkers. So why is it that such an obviously irrational system of government is the one that has predominated throughout most of history? It's a conundrum. And I think there are a number of reasons. One is that political authority in almost all societies was conceived of in religious terms, or at least partly in religious terms. It was very generally believed that things happened on earth because heaven either decreed them or at least allowed them. The purpose of a ruler in one form or another was to be an intermediary between earth and heaven, humans and gods. His role was to ensure that the writ of the gods ran on earth, that earth was managed and that humans behaved in ways acceptable to the gods. And there was the general threat that if that did not happen, society would disintegrate. The gods, in one sense or another, would have their revenge, which is all a somewhat long-winded way of saying that hereditary monarchs almost always were in some senses sacred. They were not necessarily themselves gods. Indeed, they couldn't be gods in the great salvation religions. But they were nevertheless something quite different to mere ordinary humans. The second point is that hereditary monarchy seemed natural. In almost all societies, carpenter son succeeded carpenter father. Merchant son succeeded merchant father. So why would not royal son succeed royal father? It just seemed natural. And that brings up this whole issue of naturalness. After all, if, as in their slightly different ways, all the great religions stressed, God had created human beings, if something was natural to human beings, it must be God-given. Now, all the great political thinkers, and this is just common sense, stress that human beings are social animals and that human beings can only achieve great things in society rather than on their own. It was very generally believed that society could only survive if it had a supreme arbiter to adjudicate disputes, a supreme defender to keep off foreign enemies, etc., etc., etc. And this is the king, or if the polity is big enough, the emperor. And in their various different ways, all the religions sort of said the same thing as St. Paul, the powers that be are of God. Because after all, if human beings needed a monarch in order that society should flourish and they should flourish within society, then they were indeed, in some senses, God-given. Again, this immediately points to the fact that apart from being sacred and natural, there are also some deeply pragmatic, prudential reasons why hereditary monarchy was so widely defended and prevailed in most eras, in most societies. It was very generally believed, not universally, but very generally believed, that the alternative to monarchy was anarchy. Almost all, in fact, all the great traditions of political thought believed that the bulk of the population, which meant all women, all but what we would describe as middle or upper class property owning males, were incapable of reason and were therefore best subjected to authority rather than allowed any role in exercising authority. Partly it might be argued that they were too foolish or even too sinful, certainly too poorly educated, perhaps simply too absolutely consumed with the need to keep their noses above the water, struggling for existence. So the idea of any version of democracy was usually ruled out. Monarchy existed to keep the plebs in order and steer them in the right direction. But it was also very widely feared that if elites were given free rein for their disputes, their rivalries, for their struggle, to get the goodies of political power, society would disintegrate. Elected monarchy was very widely seen as, again, an open sesame to civil war among the elites. And it is worth remembering that there was very considerable, to the extent we can judge, there was very significant popular support for powerful hereditary monarchy as a source of stability. It was, after all, the plebs who suffered most from anarchy and from foreign invasion. And the idea of a powerful monarch who would be a barrier against the unlimited exploitation of the elites, foreign invasions, etc., etc., etc. That was pretty strong. It is interesting that when the governor of the future Emperor Joseph II, about whom I've been talking already, in other words, in the mid-18th century, talked to Joseph about hereditary monarchy and its advantages, he didn't bother to invoke God. He didn't even bother to invoke the ancient history of the dynasty, though he probably believed in both sources of royal legitimacy. What he said to Joseph, and this is in the spirit of the rational enlightenment, is just look around you. Hereditary monarchy prevails in Europe. Look at the occasional examples of non-hereditary elected monarchy, the Holy Roman Empire, Poland. Look at their weakness, look at their failure. In reality, common sense, history, experience point to the fact that hereditary monarchy works best. So it's interesting. And it is certainly the case that in almost all the ancient traditions of political thought, India, China, you name it, some version of sacred hereditary monarchy is the norm. The great exception are the Greeks, Aristotle, for instance, most famously. And Aristotle, in a way, is the Washington Consensus 2,000 years or 2,800 years before its time, because he did argue not merely that democracy, by which he meant, of course, the rule of middle-class males, was the best system of government. Like the Washington Consensus, he argued that it was actually the only viable system of government once one was dealing with a society which contained very many educated middle-class males, rational creatures, as he would have put it. Of course, not all Greek thinkers believe this, the obvious counterpart being Plato, with his idea of guardianship, the idea that the rulers of the state required the specific training more than training, education, upbringing, almost steeping in wisdom, in the arts of rulership. The whole idea of guardianship, if you like. They were the guardians of the community. And as he put it in, the Republic, either kings must become philosophers, or we must create guardians who were collective philosopher kings. And in a way which is perhaps a little silly, but I think not completely silly, it does seem to me that the contemporary competition between the United States and China is, in one sense, Aristotle against Plato. Certainly, the most important ruling class or ruling elite in history, which takes up the idea of Platonic guardianship, is the Chinese Confucian bureaucracy. And there are really quite interesting similarities between its self-perception and indeed to some extent its training in rulership and Plato's ideas. Sure, I mean, I think Plato would no doubt be appalled by the contemporary cadres of the PRC, but I suspect Aristotle would have a few things to worry about, when he looked at the good citizens of Wyoming or something. So, I mean, it's not a perfect description, but I think it does bring out something which is still relevant. The great catch, though, with Aristotle is that he only believed that democracy was possible in a medium-sized city-state. And of course, the basic point, and this was proved time and time again in history, it's common sense, was that you might be able to sustain democracy within the city-state or might not. Many democratic systems folded from within. The problem was that the city-state in the long run could never protect itself against much bigger external rivals, predators, you name it, who simply controlled resources on a vastly greater scale. And that, again, bore out the general comment, which Joseph II's governor made to him, was that you needed some kind of political system which could exercise authority over sufficient resources and population to be capable of defending itself. After all, the most basic function of any political system is to defend itself. All right, another I can't talk about all the key elements of hereditary monarchy, but one very important one certainly is the role of women. Now, look, women are second to men in hereditary monarchy and hereditary imperial monarchy, just as they are second to men in all political systems I've ever come across, with the exception of, I think, some small polities in traditional Africa, but that is not my subject today, and I'm not the person to talk about it. But women really mattered in hereditary monarchy for some fundamental and relatively obvious structural reasons. Firstly, hereditary monarchy is dynasty, in other words, family in power. The all-important issue in any political system of succession to power in a hereditary monarchy is determined by biological reproduction. Well, crafty men have found all sorts of scheming ways to keep women out of bureaucracies, armies, law courts, you name it, but nobody's ever been crafty enough to keep women out of family and reproduction. So women are right at the center of the system. Secondly, the absolute holy grail in court politics, and this is the politics of hereditary monarchy, is access to the monarch, access to the supreme source of decision-making and of patronage. And the holy grail to the power of 10 is sole access for considerable time. Well, in the nature of things, it is the monarch's sexual partners who have sole access for long periods. There are variations here and rather fascinating ones, as always. I mean, for example, many of the imperial monarchies I study were harem systems. In other words, the emperor could disappear into his harem, sometimes literally for weeks on end, surrounded by his womenfolk, and the only men who had access to him were eunuchs. That creates a rather different type of court politics in significant ways to the one that we are more used to in systems where men and women mingle, etc., 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 etc. The third point, after dynasty and after access, is that the politics of hereditary monarchy are often about policy, but they are literally always about patronage. In other words, who gets the jobs, who gets the pensions, who gets the goodies. Now, women very seldom were in positions of official executive authority. There were, of course, the occasional and sometimes very remarkable female monarchs, empresses in the full sense. They figure quite largely in the book. There were also the more common and also sometimes remarkable regents. It was in fact, in all cultural system, motherhood is respected, or at least, yeah. So it was usually the case that if a child inherited the throne, his mother would exercise the power of regency, either alone very often or sometimes shared. This reflects the culture. It also reflects, again, pure pragmatism and experience. It was much safer to make a child's mother the regent than to make one of his uncles the regent. The wicked uncle who usurps nephew's throne is it's like the stepmother, an absolute traditional sort of wicked figure in history. A mother is much more likely to have a strong commitment to her son than an uncle is. But also, of course, her own authority is rooted in the son. She has no independent authority. He goes, she loses her position. An uncle can actually displace a nephew and argue that you need an effective adult on the throne, etc., etc., etc. But, I mean, these are rarities. The normal rule is that women do not hold official positions of executive authority. But, aristocratic politics, court politics, the politics of hereditary monarchy is all about networks, lineages, marriage, alliances, all this kind of thing. Women are absolutely at the center of these patronage networks. So they matter. I mean, in one sense, looking at consorts, in other words, empresses to queens sometimes, the words depend from one culture to another, is a good way of understanding one of the key issues of the book, which is the question of the role of the individual. Individual biography as against structure. I've already talked about this. Now, you can, to some extent, make structural generalizations and comparisons. On the whole, a European consort is in a better position than a Chinese empress, let alone an Ottoman concubine, etc., etc. Firstly, monogamy. Secondly, the taboo on illegitimate children inheriting property. And in the European tradition, the throne is a sort of private property, almost, family property. And thirdly, the great difficulties in terms of divorce. In that sense, the European monarch has got a security, not total, but much greater, even than a Chinese empress who can be put away, let alone, of course, an Ottoman concubine. And yet, in the end, the power of a woman almost always depends on her hold over the man who is the sovereign and exercises sovereign authority. Trot along to 18th century France. Louis XV's wife, and Louis XV is a sort of minor emperor. His wife, Marie Leczinska, has the protection given to all Christian consorts. Louis XV never dreamt of putting her away and would have been very hard-pressed to do so. He would probably not have been able to divorce her. He would certainly not have been able to disinherit their only son, the Dauphin. That would have been simply inconceivable. And she has her own household, a bit of patronage, and much formal respect is paid to her. On the other hand, nobody who knew or knows anything about the court of Louis XV, or indeed of European politics at that time, doubts that the king's most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, exercises far more political power than Marie Leczinska. So you come back to the individual as against, the office. The most powerful consorts are those who combine institutional and personal power. And that helps to explain why among the most famous consorts in European history, and disastrous, are Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I of England, Marie Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI of France, and Alexandra Fyodorovna, the wife of the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II. Here you have women who were, protected by the position as European consort, Christian wife, etc., but also exercised a very powerful emotional and sexual hold over their husbands, who were faithful to them apart from anything else. And they were hated partly for that reason, because of the power they obviously held over their husbands. They seemed to dominate their husbands. Now, is there an element of misogyny in this? Yes, there is an enormous element of misogyny in it. Any woman who was seen as exercising great power, apart from anything else, was always denounced for sexual depravity, lust, you name it, etc., etc. Right the way back to the earliest origins of what you could describe as Parisian public opinion. And one's talking about the 13th century, the mother of St. Louis, Blanche of Castile, absolutely famous for her piety, etc., is denounced in handwritten pamphlets which are circulated in Paris, firstly for having, a love affair with the papal legate. Again, this is real good old sort of traditional European prurience, and for secretly channeling France's wealth to her Castilian relatives in what we now call Spain, etc., etc. Right the way back. By the time poor Marie Antoinette arrives 500 years later, of course, this is, and she catches the lot of it, etc., etc., etc. And yet, although, of course, deeply misogynist and deeply unfair, and sometimes, as in poor Marie Antoinette's case, tragic, there is a certain logic to this in a misogynist world. The emperor is, in a sense, a hereditary lion tamer. It is his job to manage the ruthless, ambitious, tough types who, get to the top of the political system. If he can't even be seen to manage his wife, well, of course, his legitimacy, is very badly affected. And that is, of genuine political importance. If you look to some extent at Charles's England, but certainly Louis XVI's France and Nicholas II's Russia, this is actually a genuinely significant factor in the collapse of the dynasties. A point to make about all three women, and indeed about European consorts in general, is that they were foreigners. Alexandra is called the German in the First World War. Marie Antoinette is the Austrian. Henrietta Maria is the French woman and the Catholic on top of that. And that is a very extra factor in their unpopularity and vulnerability. It is unique or almost unique to the European tradition, and brings us to another issue, which is how monarchs chose their consorts, which is actually very important. Monarchs in Europe, and almost only in Europe, always married foreign princesses, at least from about the 15th century. On the odd occasion when they didn't, it caused a great scandal and turbulence. Now, that had its advantages. Of course, it raised the prestige of the monarch and the dynasty above mere aristocracy. It also, in the European case, contributed to a sense that there was a European family of nations, even if those nations were often squabbling with each other. But it had obvious problems, one of which was that very often your queen or empress was not just a foreigner, she was drawn from a major rival dynasty. I mean, Marie Antoinette is a Habsburg, as many other French queens were. The Habsburgs were about the only dynasty in Europe which the House of Capet, the Bourbons, saw as their equals, but also as their rivals. So the poor, wretched Marie Antoinette is not just a foreigner, but she is, of course, the absolute symbol of, a French reversal of tradition, the new alliance with Austria, which is deeply unpopular in much of the French elite. An alternative strategy, and one which is very widespread in most other dynasties, imperial dynasties, is to marry members of your own elite, in inverted commas, aristocrats. The problem there is that risks, firstly, causing enormous jealousy within the elite. You've picked one of the elite families and raised it above the others. You also risk boosting the arrogance of what are very often already very arrogant and ambitious, court aristocrats. You even at an extreme risk having your throne usurped by an aristocratic family. This happens quite often in some political traditions. So the alternative to that is to marry below you. The Russian Tsars before Peter married not foreign princesses and not members of the Russian court aristocracy, but ladies from middling gentry families. And that actually works pretty well because it doesn't cause enormous jealousies within the aristocracy. It doesn't create families which are in any sense rivals to the dynasty itself. But it does actually create allies who are completely dependent and loyal to the dynasty. But often, the Tsarina's male relatives are actually important political figures in her husband's reign. Rather interestingly, with Peter, or after Peter, Romanov princes marry foreign princesses, and this ends. Catherine II, after she's got rid of her husband, doesn't remarry, and her two most famous lovers, Orlov and Potemkin, both come from the same real middle gentry world that traditionally Russian Tsars picked their consorts from. Just going to have some water. And they play very, very, very important roles in her reign. The Orlov Grigorian, his brothers, they essentially keep the guards and in order in the 1760s when she's vulnerable, and play important other roles in her reign. Grigory Potemkin is essentially not just her chief advisor, but the viceroy of the whole of southern Russia. The extreme case are the Ottomans, who, once they are established, very seldom marry and produce sons from concubines in their harem. And it is a very interesting story. The harem is not just a place of fun and sexual whatever. Succession is far too serious an issue to be just a question of fun. A woman who produces a son with the Sultan never sleeps with him again, or is never allowed to produce another son anyway. If her son succeeds, she becomes the most important woman in the empire. If, in the nature of things, which is most usual, he fails, he dies, and she is relegated to the outer corners of the sort of third palace. This is court politics as a zero-sum game of the most ferocious sort. That, in turn, has implications for the succession, and succession is the last thing I will talk about now. Vital in dynastic politics, as in all political systems. And fundamentally, it's the same as in the contemporary world. There is an enormous difference between presidential and parliamentary system. There is a great difference in parliamentary systems between first past the post and different versions of proportional, etc., etc., etc. The same was true in monarchical succession systems. At one extreme, you have Europe, male primogeniture, strict succession rules, etc., etc. At the other extreme, you have the steppe nomadic tradition where the sons and sometimes even the nephews and cousins fight it out. I mean, the European system is great as regards stability, runs this certain risk of putting incompetence on the throne. If at the other extreme you have, a battle between the sons, they fight it out, that implies that the person who wins is going to have significant political and military skills at the expense of periodic civil war. So, you have to choose between the two. On the whole, the European system, I think, comes out tops. If you look at the Ottomans and the Mughals, both of whom are at one remove descendants of the steppe tradition, you can see how the principle of fighting it out between the sons works. And it does produce outstandingly competent rulers. The Mughal emperors, the first 6 or 7, are, beyond any question, exceptionally able. The Mughals can to some extent get away with this system, at least for a time, because actually in geopolitical terms, they're secure. They have no really serious foreign enemies on their borders. The Ottomans, who start off with the same kind of system, do have Christian Europe to the west and the Persians to the east. And it simply becomes too dangerous to have civil wars which allow foreign powers to get involved. So the Ottomans end the system of the sons fighting it out. Usually the eldest son succeeds and simply murders all his brothers when he comes to the throne. That comes within a whisker of destroying the dynasty in the early 17th century. So they go over to another system, which is that basically when the Sultan succeeds, all his brothers sit in the harem, more or less under house arrest. They don't get a decent education. They have no exposure to the outside world. When he dies, the next brother down gets dumped on the throne, completely, of course, unprepared for rule. Talk about this in the third lecture, but if you're looking at the triumph of the Russian Empire over the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, a very significant factor is leadership. Peter I and Catherine II, and no one on the Ottoman side, even remotely in that category or that level. It matters, in other words. But the European system of strict primogeniture, plus, of course, monogamy, plus no divorce, plus no illegitimate children, plus constant marriage of cousins, doesn't just result in incompetence often on the throne, it also often results in dynasties dying out. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs died out in 1700. The Austrian branch died out in the male line in 1740. It is in the nature of things that when that happens, the closest heirs are often foreign princes. Charles V and Philip II would have turned in their graves to see their thrones inherited by their arch rival, the French Bourbons. And that does bring out some of the uniqueness of the European monarchical tradition. Also, just sheer chance, almost uniquely, the French royal house survives, still exists in the direct male line now, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years after it became kings of France. And indeed, not quite in the male line, but essentially in the line of the legitimate line of Spanish succession. Its representative is the King of Spain today. So the extent to which, particularly in Europe, where dynasty matters more than in any other part of the world, the extent of biological chance adds to all the other uncertainties of politics. And there I really will shut up. And tomorrow I'll talk about ruling empires.